Start by reviewing what contribution analysis is. So you have some big picture perspective, and then we're going to go into problem 1, which is an example of the basic calculation methods. So contribution analysis is basically, I think of contribution as what is left over after covering your variable cost, or the amount of sales revenue that's left over to contribute to any other financial goals that you have, such as fixed costs, making a profit. We use it a lot of ways. So basically, you have to understand the difference between fixed and variable costs to make use of contribution analysis. So total fixed costs remain the same no matter how many units are produced. So basically, we call it fixed when it's not tied specifically to one unit, whether you're producing or selling. So they're kind of overhead costs, or they're big picture costs, costs that are really shared by all of the units in production. Total variable costs, on the other hand, increase dramatically and in direct proportion to the number of units you're producing or selling. So for example, if we are making shirts, we might have a sewing machine, we might have a building. And we're going to have that machine and that building no matter how many shirts we sell. But our variable costs are going to be things that are tied to a specific shirt. So the more shirts we sell, the more fabric we're going to need, the more buttons we're going to need, the more thread we're going to need, and perhaps the more hours of our labor to put the shirts together. It's going to take like almost 1,000 times more fabric, buttons, thread, labor to produce 1,000 shirts than it would to produce one, whereas we might be able to do all that with our one machine in our one room. And so the math is totally different for those, and that's why you cannot mix them up. So typical fixed costs include facilities, equipment, administrative labor, or salaries. That they might do some things for a specific product, but mostly they're doing overhead stuff for the business as a whole. Advertising campaigns, and anybody whose time cannot be clearly allocated to a specific unit of production or service. Variable costs include your production materials, your production labor, or your service labor if you're providing a service like a haircut or an oil change. And any time you have employee time that can be allocated to a specific sale, and if you did not make that sale, you would not need that employee's time. So variable costs are frequently but not always stated per unit. Sometimes you know that you need, say, more hours of labor to produce a shirt, but you can't necessarily say off the top of your head how many hours of labor it takes to produce one shirt, because people are working on things, their labor time increases, but sometimes you have to just look at your total variable costs and then divide that by the number of units in order to get an estimated per unit cost. So in a nutshell, producing or selling more items does not increase your fixed cost, and that is what makes them fixed. So effectively, fixed costs are a big contributor to economies of scale. Fixed costs become more cost efficient as they are spread over more items. So the more items you're producing, the less important your fixed costs become in your calculations. Producing or selling more items does increase your variable costs, and it increases them dramatically. So for every additional item you sell, you are adding to your variable costs. And it's really important to remember that. So that's why the math is so different on those. So contribution analysis takes your variable costs out first, and that allows you to focus on what you have left over after covering your variable costs to contribute to your other goals. So your selling price is the source of all money coming in. So your selling price times the number of items you've sold equals your revenue. So revenue is everything you have coming in without taking out any cost. Revenue minus cost equals profit. More specifically, revenue minus your variable costs equals your gross profit, also called your total contribution. Now, there are different industries will have different practices for what they include in gross profit versus contribution, but for our purposes, we're not going to worry about those details because the focus in our class is not on the parts of gross profit and total contribution that are different. So for us, it's pretty much always the same. So your selling price is your money coming in. Your selling price times your quantity sold is your revenue minus your cost is your profit, your revenue minus your variable cost is your gross profit, your revenue minus both your variable cost and your fixed cost is your net profit. Okay, so now let's get into the contribution analysis. Part of this is about we calculate a a figure that we're going to call the contribution, and then we're going to use that for all kinds of other things. So your basic unit here is your per unit contribution. So this means per item. You take your per unit selling price minus your per unit variable cost, and that gives you your per unit contribution, aka the dollars that you're making per item that you sell. Sometimes your variable costs are not neatly organized by unit. For example, you might have to take the total amount you spent on fabric and divide it by the number of shirts in order to get the estimate of the cost of fabric per shirt. Because when you bought it from the store, you just bought bolts of fabric, right? So you can take your total variable cost divided by your number of units and get the per unit variable cost from there, and then you can use that in this equation in order to get your per unit contribution. Or you can take your total sales revenue minus your total variable costs and divide that answer by the number of units, and then that will be your per unit contribution. So a few ways to get it, but it basically all amounts to your per unit selling price minus your per unit variable cost. You can also do it by percentage. So contribution margin, basically anytime you see the word margin, that means we're talking about a percentage. So we're going to put everything in percentage form, and that makes it easier to compare numbers that might differ a lot in terms of total volume. Okay, so your contribution margin is going to be exactly what you just did, your per unit contribution that we calculated on the previous page, unit sales price minus your per unit variable cost. So you do that step first, and then you divide that by your selling price. And that tells you for every unit you sell, what percentage of that money coming in do you have to cover your other costs. Sometimes you know the percentage of the variable cost, so you can go 1 minus your percent of the variable cost in order to estimate your contribution. Sometimes you just know the percentage contribution margin. Frequently a business will have that as a regular item, and so you'll encounter many problems where you're given a percent contribution margin, and because these numbers are very familiar to people, business professionals can glance at a percentage contribution and they can instantly have a feel for all kinds of factors about the business. So all contribution analysis basically comes down to your financial goal divided by your contribution. So if you're going to do it in units, then you can take your financial goal goes on top divided by your per unit contribution. And that's going to give you the sales quantity you need to meet that financial goal. And your answer is going to be in units. So remember, our per unit contribution is your per unit selling price minus your per unit variable cost. If you're going to do your break-even analysis, for example, total fixed cost is going to be your financial goal. Your goal is to cover your fixed cost. So total fixed cost is the number you're going to put up here. And that will tell you how many sales you need to make in order to break even. And in the percentage version, your financial goal goes on top, same. And on the bottom, you put your contribution margin in the percentage version of your contribution. So that's the percentage of the selling price left over after covering your variable costs. And then when you do it that way, your answer is going to be in dollars, sales revenue that you need to meet your sales goal. So we're going to do basically 3 different versions of this type of problem, depending on what your financial goal is. And that's going to shape the rest of your problem. One version is your break even. So when you're going to break even, your goal is to cover your total fixed cost, and that means total fixed cost is what's going to go on the top of your equation, the top of your fraction. Or maybe you want to make a target profit. So in that case, your goal is to cover your fixed cost and then bring in money over and above that. So you are going to add together your fixed cost plus whatever profit you want to make, and you put that on the top of your equation. And our third approach is going to be incremental contribution analysis. So in that case, the goal is whatever cost you're interested in. So for example, you might be asking, how much more will we have to sell to make our money back if we spend another $1 million on advertising? We use this all the time in marketing because that allows us to ask a question like, okay, how much we have to sell to make that $1 million on advertising worth it? And then you can run your contribution analysis, and then you can say, okay, now is it realistic that this ad that we're thinking of spending $1 million on is going to lead to that increase in sales. And if not, we're not going to do it. And it allows you to contemplate those questions without getting into a total analysis of your costs and your business structure and the number of units you're already selling. So you can ignore all that and look at just a specific problem. Okay, so for break even, your goal is to cover your total fixed costs. And when you break even, your profit is zero. The zero profit is valuable only in the sense that it is not a negative number. So it's the only reason we do it all the time in business is because we want to make sure we don't lose money. So before we go into some business venture, we often want to know what would be the minimum we'd have to sell to avoid losing money. And that will tell us whether we should go into this or not. You can estimate whether that is realistic. So when you're going to do a break-even analysis, the number that goes on the top of your equation is your total fixed cost. When your goal is to generate a target profit, the number that's going to go on top is your fixed cost plus your desired profit in dollars. So whatever you do with this problem, don't forget you have to cover your fixed cost and make your desired profit. So just a few more details about the incremental. The goal is going to be whatever additional cost you're interested in, so you're going to put that on top, and you want to remember that the answer is in additional units or sales, not the total number of units or sales you would need. It's only going to be additional units or sales. Kitty just so badly wants to be in this video. Okay, let's take a look at problem 1 as an example. So in problem 1, we are selling a CD. So it cost us $1.25 to make for each CD for the CD package and the disc itself. We pay 35 cents per CD in royalties to the songwriter. We spend $1 per CD in royalties to the recording artists, the singers. We have advertising and promotion for $275,000. We have studio recordings overhead for $250,000, and we have our selling price is $9 per CD to the CD distributor, not the end user. Keeping it simple here. Okay, so first thing we got to do is we got to figure out which of these costs are fixed and which are variable. Now this problem makes it really simple for you because you know that variable costs, anything that's per CD is a variable cost. Kitty, I'm really trying to make this video here. So our per unit variable costs are, all we have to do is add these together. Sum G5 right here, these three numbers gets 260. So that is my per unit variable costs, and my total fixed costs are, remember, every cost has to be either fixed or variable. So I see two fixed costs here, advertising and overhead. All right, now that I have those two pieces of information ready, I can go on to do the rest of the problem. So my contribution per unit is going to be my per unit selling price equals my selling price minus my per unit variable cost that I summed already up here, $6.40. So to break even, remember when we break even, our goal is to cover our fixed cost. So my problem is going to be my financial goal on top divided by my per unit contribution. So to set that up in Excel where we don't have the line that we're drawing in our fraction, I'm going to set it up as my total fixed cost up here divided by my per unit contribution. And if you want to be fancy, I just added that little extra formula, round up, in order to round up my per units, my units, because you can't sell a quarter of a CD, right? You have to sell another CD, and if you follow the usual rules of rounding, then 82 CDs would round down, but technically if you actually did that, you would fall just a little bit short of breaking even. So we want to, when we're doing units, we want to round up. Usually, obviously that only affects one unit, so usually people don't bother to do that, but technically we would need to sell 82,032 units. And if I want to do some niceties here, I like to have a comma, and then I would like to have decrease my decimal to a whole number. To do the break-even volume in dollars, there's two ways I could calculate that. And in general, you want, when you can see that there's two ways you could calculate something, that's a way that you can check your own work, make sure it works. So one way is I could use the contribution margin. And I didn't calculate a contribution margin, so I'm going to calculate it over here. Per unit and margin. So all I have to do to calculate the margin is I'm going to take the 640 per unit contribution divided by the selling price, and this tells me, let's make it a percent. This tells me that for every CD I sell, 71% of that money is going to be kept, and the other part of it is going to be used to cover the variable cost. So roughly 29. So 29% of every CD I sell goes just to produce the CD and pay those royalties, leaving 71% of that $9 for me. So my break-even volume in dollars, one way I can do it is I can take my total fixed cost as my financial goal divided by my contribution margin, and that tells me I need to sell $738,281.25 worth of CDs in order to break even. Now, another way I could do that is I know I already calculated that I need to sell 82,000 CDs. So if I sold 82,000 CDs, then how much money would I have coming in? So we can take our 82,000 times our $9 price per CD, and we get the same answer. 738,288. And notice it didn't come out quite right, and that's because of rounding here, because we would probably actually technically be a little bit short here. Let's break that down on the side here. What would be my total revenue if I'm going to sell 1 million CDs? So it's going to be 1 million CDs times $9 per CD. So 9 million would be my revenue. Price times the quantity sold. And how much would be my total variable costs if I sold 1 million CDs? So that's going to be 1 million times my per unit variable cost. So it's going to be $2.6 million in producing the CDs and paying the royalties. So one way I could do this problem is I could subtract my revenue minus my total variable costs, and my answer is going to be 6.4 million. And this here is my gross profit because I didn't include all the costs. Right? I also have to include the fixed costs. So to get my net profit, since the problem asked for net profit, I'm going to also subtract my fixed costs from up here. And I'm going to get 5.875 million. Okay, so another way we could have done that is we could take our contribution. So I could have taken my contribution times the million, and I get 6.4. So I get my gross profit already. So I could say contribution times, and now I can take my fixed costs out, and I get the same answer. So it's often a good idea to check yourself by calculating things that you expect to be the same answer. If you do the problem another way, you expect to get the same answer, you do that and it works, that helps you feel confident that you've done it correctly. Okay, so now I want to know what would be the necessary CD unit volume. I just wanted to point out here that we divided 525,000 by 0.71 percentage, and that resulted in our number getting bigger. So in order to cover our fixed cost of 525,000, we have to generate 738,000 in sales, because we only get to keep 71% of the money. And so when you divide 525,000 by a percentage or fraction or decimal, whatever you want to call it, but because we divided it by a number smaller than 1, it actually made our total amount we need to break even. That gave us a bigger number, which is what you'd expect, right? So that's another thing you can do to check that you're on the right track. Ask yourself, is it normal that I divided by this, I got a bigger number? Would we expect that you would need more sales in order to cover your fixed costs? Yes. So we know we're on the right track there. Okay, so now this is a target profit type of contribution analysis. So the number that's going to go on the top of my problem is going to be my financial goal. And my financial goal is going to be my fixed costs plus the $200,000 profit I want to make. And I'm putting parentheses around that because otherwise Excel won't know that it needs to do this part and then use the answer. So we're going to first add together our fixed costs and our target profit to get the answer to our total financial goal for the top of our equation, and then I'm going to divide that by my per unit contribution. I'm using the per unit contribution because it said they want the answer in units, not dollars. If they asked for the answer in dollars, I would have used the contribution margin. Okay, so that tells me my CD unit volume to achieve a $200,000 profit would be 113,281.25 CDs. Of course, I can't sell 0.25 CDs. So I'm going to round up that whole thing. I need another set of parentheses in here for the problem. Okay, there you go. That is problem 1.